Step inside Sherlock Mysteries, where logic meets deception. Kindly like and subscribe to Sherlock Mysteries. Which part of the world are you watching from? Our story begins. Chapter, I fay the hour that refused to move. It was upon an evening saturated with cold rain and the lingering vapors of the Thames that the matter first presented itself at Baker Street. The fire burned low, casting an amber glow upon the Persian slipper, wherein Holmes persisted in storing his tobacco, and the familiar odor of chemicals drifted faintly from the corner table, where some experiment lay half completed. Holmes himself reclined in his armchair, gaunt profile illuminated against the gloom, when a hurried knocking disturbed the quietude of our rooms. Mrs. Hudson admitted Inspector Lestrade, whose narrow shoulders appeared yet more contracted beneath the damp sheen of his overcoat. His keen, restless eyes betrayed the excitement of a man confronted with circumstances he neither understood nor fully trusted. A regrettable business, Mr. Holmes, he began without ceremony. A watchmaker, Edmund Harrow by name, found dead at the base of the Weatherby clock tower scarcely an hour ago. The glass of the great clock face is shattered. The mechanism halted at precisely 20 minutes past 9. We suspect faulty maintenance. The fellow appears to have fallen from the ladder while attending to repairs. Holmes neither interrupted nor expressed surprise. His long fingers remained pressed together beneath his chin. Grey eyes fixed upon some invisible horizon beyond the inspector's shoulder. Accident, you believe? Holmes inquired at last. The ladder was upright. No signs of struggle. The glass is brittle, as these municipal fittings often are. The hour was wet, slippery footing, a straightforward case. Holmes rose in a single fluid motion and crossed to the window. Rain streaked the panes in languid threads. When time freezes, he murmured softly, "It is rarely the clock that fails." Lestrade frowned. "You suggest foul play." "I suggest only that the obvious explanation is seldom the correct one, Inspector." By dawn the rain had abated to a grey mist, and we stood beneath the looming structure of Weatherby Clock Tower. The edifice, erected some 30 years prior in the confident optimism of mid-Victorian enterprise, dominated the square with austere dignity. Its stone face was mottled by soot and damp, and the great circular dial, now fractured, gleamed with a sinister irregularity. The hands remained rigid at 20 minutes past 9, as though arrested mid-breath. The body had been removed, yet the faint chalk outline traced upon the cobbles bore silent witness to where Edmund Harrow had lain. A maintenance ladder stood upright near the tower's base, its wooden rungs glistening with moisture. No splintered rung or broken hinge betrayed any failure. Holmes circled the ladder slowly, bending now and again to examine some minute particular. He ran his fingertips lightly along the wood, then examined them with thoughtful detachment. "No recent breakage," he observed. "The wood is sound, the joints firm, the ladder did not betray him." Lestrade shifted impatiently. Then the glass gave way. Holmes's gaze ascended to the shattered clock face. A spiderweb of cracks radiated from a central rupture just above the numeral 9. "Curious," he murmured. "In what way?" "The impact pattern suggests force from within rather than without." Lestrade stiffened. "From within, impossible. The mechanism lies behind the dial." "Precisely." Holmes requested access to the interior of the tower, and a constable produced the necessary key. We ascended a narrow spiral stair, the air within redolent of oil and old dust. The ticking which ought to have echoed through such a space was absent. Instead, there prevailed a silence so complete that even our breathing seemed intrusive. The clock mechanism stood immense and intricate before us, a network of brass gears, counterweights, and escapements. Yet its motion was arrested. Holmes approached the central assembly and examined it with rapt attention. He stooped, peered, then produced his lens. "The mainspring has not snapped," he observed quietly, "nor has the escapement wheel suffered fracture, yet the mechanism has been deliberately obstructed." "Obstructed," Lestrade repeated. Holmes indicated a slender shard of metal lodged between two gear teeth. A wedge, inserted with precision. It would halt the movement instantaneously. Lestrade stared. "You mean someone stopped the clock?" Holmes nodded. "At 20 minutes past 9, to be exact." Why in heaven's name would anyone do such a thing? That, Inspector, is the only question of consequence. We descended once more to the square below. Massive brass wheels interlocked with patient authority. Iron counterweights descended through channels in the masonry, cables taut and silent, bore the burden of regulated descent. Though arrested, the system retained a certain latent energy, as if resentful of its unnatural stillness. Holmes set down his lantern upon a projecting ledge, and its flame cast shifting shadows across the polished surfaces. He approached the principal gear assembly with that peculiar mixture of reverence and scrutiny he reserved for finely wrought instruments. "It is," he remarked quietly, "a cathedral of brass and iron constructed to measure eternity in fractions." He bent forward, examining first the escapement, then the pendulum rod, then the great driving wheel, whose rotation governed the advance of the minute hand. His long fingers hovered just above the metal, never touching until observation had preceded contact. Lestrade, who had accompanied us with visible impatience, cleared his throat. "You have already found a wedge placed to halt the motion, Mr. Holmes. Surely that explains the stoppage?" Holmes did not answer at once. He moved slowly around the framework, lantern in hand, until the light struck obliquely across the teeth of a large intermediate gear. There he halted so abruptly that I nearly collided with him. "Ah," the single syllable carried more significance than many speeches. "What is it?" I asked. Holmes crouched, bringing his eyes level with the teeth. He withdrew from his pocket a small magnifying lens and held it close. "Observe, Watson, the third tooth from the upper quadrant." I bent beside him. At first, I perceived nothing unusual. The teeth, though dulled by years of friction, appeared uniform in their curvature and spacing. "I see only wear," I admitted. Holmes shifted the lantern slightly. The flame flickered, and the shadow retreated from one particular tooth. "There," he said softly. Now I discerned it. The surface of a single tooth bore fine striations inconsistent with the smooth polish of its companions. The metal had been filed supply, but with intention. The edge was not rounded by age. It was trimmed, shaved by recent abrasion. At its base, caught within a narrow crevice of the housing, lay minute metallic shavings, bright against the darker patina of older dust. "A careless adjustment?" I ventured. Holmes shook his head at once. "Not careless, Watson, calculated." He rose and considered the wheel in its arrested position. "This gear," he continued, tapping lightly upon the rim, "engages with the driving arbor, which, in turn, advances the minute hand. A reduction of even a fraction of a millimeter upon one tooth alters the moment of engagement. When this altered tooth meets resistance under full tension, the effect would be sudden." "You mean it would jam?" "Precisely. But not arbitrarily. The jam would occur at a predictable point in rotation, at a precise minute." Lestrade frowned. "You are suggesting the tooth was filed so that it would catch at 20 minutes past 9. Holmes inclined his head. "Let us reason it out. The clock was wound at 6 o'clock yesterday evening. According to the custodian's record, its rotation rate is constant. The alteration of a single tooth ensures that upon its engagement under descending weight, friction increases beyond tolerance. The mechanism arrests. The wedge, previously discovered, ensured the stoppage remained absolute." He gestured toward the narrow, metal sliver still lodged between two secondary gears. "The wedge was not the cause, Inspector. It was the assurance." I stared at the uneven tooth, feeling the chill of comprehension. Then the clock was designed to stop itself. Indeed. Holmes delicately removed the metal filings with the tip of his penknife and examined them in the lantern light. "Fresh," he observed. "No oxidation. The filing occurred within the last 24 hours. Lestrade folded his arms, and Edmund Harrow was contracted to inspect this clock. "Yes," Holmes replied evenly, "which implies either that he made the alteration or that he discovered it." The suggestion hung in the air like suspended dust. We examined the remainder of the mechanism in silence. Holmes traced each linkage, tested each joint, and confirmed that no other irregularities existed. All was precise, save for that single violated tooth. As we descended the tower once more, Holmes's expression bore the inward intensity that signaled active deduction. "Consider the psychology of the act," he said when we had regained the square below. The perpetrator possessed knowledge sufficient to understand the gear ratios and rotation intervals. He calculated backward from the desired moment of stoppage. 20 minutes past 9, I said. The departure of the Northern Express. Holmes nodded, an hour upon which some event elsewhere depended. Lestrade's impatience had given way to unease. "You imply the clock was used to fabricate a public record of time." "Exactly so. A visible, authoritative timepiece, consulted by clerks, drivers, passers-by. If it declared 20 minutes past 9, then 20 minutes past 9 it must have been. But why involve Harrow?" Holmes paused near the ladder once more. "A watchmaker is uniquely positioned to recognize tampering. Suppose Harrow ascended to perform routine inspection. He would at once perceive the altered tooth. If he were honest, and by all accounts he was, he would report the irregularity, which would expose the scheme," I said. "Precisely." Lestrade glanced upward at the shattered dial, and so he was silenced. Holmes regarded the cracked glass thoughtfully. "Yet observe this, Inspector. The filing was executed by a hand both steady and practiced. The angle of abrasion suggests familiarity with mechanical tolerances, not the work of a casual saboteur. A professional, then, a man conversant with machinery, perhaps with access." Holmes knelt again at the base of the tower, scanning the cobbles. He traced the arc where the body had fallen. If Harrow discovered the alteration while within the chamber, he may have confronted its author there. Alternatively, he was lured aloft under false pretense. "Lured," Lestrade repeated. Holmes rose slowly. The clock was instructed to fail. That instruction required anticipation. The death of Edmund Harrow was not spontaneous. It was contingency. The wind shifted, stirring the lingering mist. The frozen hands above us appeared accusatory against the grey sky. "Time," Holmes continued, "is the one constant upon which society depends. To manipulate it publicly is to manipulate perception itself." We repaired once more to Harrow's workshop in Clerkenwell. Holmes requested access to the deceased's tool chest. The instruments within were immaculate, files arranged by grade, each labeled and cleaned. Holmes selected a fine metal file and held it beside the striations he had sketched in his notebook. "Note the width of the grooves," he said. "This file's teeth differ. Harrow did not use this instrument." Lestrade leaned closer. "You can distinguish that?" "Undoubtedly. The filing upon the gear bears a narrower pitch. Harrow's tools are broader in cut." "Then someone else filed the tooth," I said. "Beyond question." Holmes closed the chest gently. "Our adversary possesses mechanical competence, access to the tower, and motive tied to the precise moment of 20 minutes past 9. He anticipated resistance and inserted a wedge to guarantee cessation. When Harrow intervened, whether by discovery or refusal, he was removed." Lestrade's voice was subdued. "You speak as though the entire affair were orchestrated." Holmes's eyes glinted. "It was, Inspector. The clock did not fail. It obeyed." That evening, as we sat once more in Baker Street, Holmes drew a diagram of the gear assembly. His pencil moved with swift precision, annotating angles and rotational intervals. "One tooth altered," he mused. "1 minute manipulated, and yet the consequences ripple outward." He leaned back, gaze distant. "A man who tampers with time," he said softly, "believes himself beyond its reach. But even the most carefully measured deception leaves residue metal shavings. Watson, always metal shavings." Outside, the city resumed its restless ticking, unaware that one of its great guardians of time had been subverted by design. And in that silent chamber of brass and iron, a single uneven tooth bore silent witness to a crime, conceived not in passion, but in calculation. Chapter 3, Fay beneath the rival's sign, the investigation. Once turned toward motive, moved with a steadier and more dangerous purpose. It was Holmes's conviction that rivalry, especially where contracts and municipal pride were concerned, wealth provided soil fertile enough for schemes of deliberate complexity. Edmund Harrow, though modest in bearing, had recently secured inspection rights over several public timepieces. A commission that had, by all accounts, been sought with equal vigor by another. That other was Jonathan Reed. Reed's establishment lay south of the Thames, beneath a painted sign depicting a gilded chronometer encircled by laurel leaves. The lettering, Reed and Son, horologists to the discerning public, was executed in elaborate flourish, though no sun was presently in evidence. The shop window displayed marine chronometers, carriage clocks, and a regulator of imposing height, each arranged with studied precision. We entered to the bright chime of a doorbell, incongruously cheerful against the gravity of our errand. The interior was immaculate. Glass cases gleamed, brass fittings shone. Behind the counter stood Jonathan Reed himself, a man of perhaps 45 years, spare of build, with neatly parted dark hair, and an expression that hovered perpetually between calculation and restraint. He greeted us with civility that stopped short of warmth. "Gentlemen, how may I serve you?" Holmes introduced us with quiet courtesy and expressed regret at the circumstances that compelled our visit. "You are, I believe, acquainted with the late Edmund Harrow," Holmes began. Reed's features tightened almost imperceptibly. "Professionally, yes, we operated in the same trade, and were competitors for certain municipal contracts." Reed folded his hands upon the counter. "Competition is the marrow of commerce, Mr. Holmes. I bear no ill will toward any man for earning his livelihood. Yet, you contested the award of the Weatherby Clock Tower inspection." Reed's lips thinned. "I submitted a proposal. It was declined. Within the past fortnight." Holmes inclined his head. "And you have had no dealings with Mr. Harrow since?" "None whatsoever." Holmes allowed a silence to settle, a silence during which his gaze drifted idly, almost absent-mindedly, about the shop. Yet I knew that in that wandering glance lay concentrated attention. It came at last to rest upon a rack mounted behind the counter, a rack displaying a graduated array of metal files, each suspended by its handle in orderly sequence. Holmes stepped nearer. "A fine assortment," he remarked lightly. "Swiss manufacture, mostly," Reed replied. "I pride myself upon proper instruments." Holmes extended a hand. "May I?" Reed hesitated only a fraction before nodding. Holmes selected one of the finer files, slender, tapering, its teeth cut in a subtle diagonal pattern. He carried it toward the window, where the muted winter light fell cleanest. The file's surface bore a distinctive staggered arrangement, not the conventional uniform cut, but a slightly offset sequence of teeth, forming a faintly zigzagging striation when drawn across metal. Holmes rotated it slowly, examining the pitch and spacing. "Uncommon," he murmured. "I commission certain tools directly," Reed said with a trace of pride. "Precision demands individuality." Holmes reached into his coat and withdrew a folded scrap of paper. Upon it, pressed in graphite, was the impression he had taken of the filing marks upon the altered gear tooth at Weatherby Tower. He placed the paper upon the counter and held the file above it. The resemblance was unmistakable. The striations upon the paper aligned precisely with the staggered pitch of Reed's instrument. Each diagonal interruption corresponded to the peculiar rhythm of the file's cut. Holmes said nothing for several seconds. He merely looked from the paper to the file, then to Reed. The color drained slowly from the watchmaker's face. "This proves nothing," Reed said sharply. "Many files resemble one another." "Not this one," Holmes replied softly. "The staggered pattern is rare. It produces a distinctive abrasion. The gear tooth at Weatherby Tower was filed by such an instrument." Reed straightened, forcing composure into his posture. "My tools have not left this shop in months." Holmes smiled thinly. "Tools, sir, often travel where their owners claim they do not. You accuse me of sabotage?" Reed's voice sharpened. "I accuse no one," Holmes answered evenly. "I observe only that a gear tooth was deliberately altered to jam at 20 minutes past 9. The filing marks correspond to a tool in your possession. Edmund Harrow, who secured the contract you desired, discovered the alteration and is now dead." Reed's jaw tightened. "Are you suggesting I murdered him?" "I suggest," Holmes replied, "that you possess both motive and the means to effect the mechanical tampering." Lestrade, who had remained watchful near the doorway, stepped forward. "Where were you between 8 and 10 o'clock on the evening of Harrow's death?" Reed did not hesitate. "Here in my shop. My assistant departed at 7. I remained to complete a regulator repair. Several customers can attest to my presence earlier in the evening." "Earlier," Holmes echoed, "but not at 20 minutes past 9. Reed's composure flickered. "I do not keep a log of every minute of my existence." Holmes returned the file to its rack with deliberate care. "Tell me, Mr. Reed," he said conversationally, "how often do you visit Weatherby Tower?" "Never, yet you are familiar with its mechanism." "Any competent horologist would be." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Indeed, then you would know precisely how to calculate a stoppage at a designated minute." Reed's silence lengthened. Holmes shifted his approach, as he so often did when direct pressure yielded resistance. "Let us suppose," he continued, "that someone wished to establish an incontrovertible public record of time. Suppose that at 20 minutes past 9, the clock tower visibly confirmed the hour to any observer in the square. Such confirmation might serve to establish an alibi, or to obscure the true timing of some event elsewhere." Reed's fingers tightened imperceptibly against the counter's edge. "I know nothing of any such scheme." Holmes regarded him steadily. "Did Edmund Harrow visit you in the days preceding his death?" Number Holmes' eyes flicked briefly toward a ledger lying open near the till. "May I?" Reed hesitated once more, but Lestrade's presence discouraged refusal. Holmes examined the ledger, turning pages with swift delicacy. His finger paused. "Curious," he said. "What now?" Reed demanded. "A purchase recorded here 3 days ago, delivery of specialized tempered glass." Reed's nostrils flared. "For a regulator case?" "Of course." Holmes closed the ledger. Outside, a barge horn sounded from the river, low and mournful. Holmes turned back to Reed. "You insist your tools have not left this shop?" "I do." "And that you have not visited Weatherby Tower?" "I have not." Holmes inclined his head, as though accepting the statement at face value. "Very well." He moved toward the door, then paused. "One final question, Mr. Reed. Have you ever altered a clock mechanism to produce a deliberate stoppage?" Reed's composure hardened. "I repair clocks, Mr. Holmes. I do not instruct them to lie." Holmes's eyes narrowed slightly, as though weighing the phrasing. "We shall see," he said quietly, outside. The winter light had grown sharper. As we stepped into the street, Lestrade exhaled. "Well, you have your match. Arrest him." Holmes shook his head at once. "On the contrary. We have resemblance, not proof. The presence of a matching file does not establish its use, nor does motive alone establish guilt. But the filing is compelling," Holmes admitted, "yet too conspicuous." He glanced back at the shop sign, its gilded chronometer gleaming faintly. A man clever enough to calculate a mechanical stoppage to the minute would scarcely leave so direct a signature, unless he wished suspicion to fall precisely there. "You think Reed is being framed?" I asked. Holmes's expression grew thoughtful. "I think," he replied slowly, "that someone wishes us to see the obvious." He drew his coat closer against the chill wind. "The uneven tooth points to a file. The file points to a rival. The rival possesses motive. It is a pleasingly tidy sequence." "And yet," I prompted. Holmes's gaze lifted toward the pale winter sky. "And yet," he said softly, "crime rarely arranges itself so obligingly." As we crossed the bridge back toward the north bank, the river flowed dark and indifferent beneath us. Behind us, beneath the rival's gilded sign, Jonathan Reed resumed his vigil among clocks that ticked with relentless honesty. But somewhere within the city, a mind equally precise had measured not only minutes, but suspicion itself. Chapter 4. The bitter ledger, the municipal archive, is not, in the common estimation, a theater for strong emotion. It possesses none of the somber grandeur of a court, nor the grim urgency of a police station, nor yet the intimate tragedies of a sick room. It is a place of measured voices, of ink that has long since dulled from black to brown, of paper that crackles with the dry patience of time. And yet I have learned in my association with Sherlock Holmes that the most dramatic human motives may be traced as clearly in a clerk's docket as in a dagger's thrust. The one is merely slower in its revelation. We reached the building shortly after midday, when London's winter light had the pallor of watered milk and the air retained the damp chill of the morning's rain. The SAFA, severe and bureaucratic, rose from the street like a rebuke to imagination. Within, the corridors smelt of wet wool from the coats of petitioners and of the faint, sweet mustiness that clings to old ledgers. A porter in a stained waistcoat conducted us to a reading room where long tables stretched beneath green shaded lamps. A handful of clerks bent over their work with the steady concentration of men whose minds had been trained to find comfort in order. Holmes's manner with such officials was always instructive to observe. He could be abrupt to those who resisted him, sardonic with the vain, cutting with the dishonest. But with the dutiful and obscure, the men and women who guard the world's quiet facts, he was uniformly courteous, even gentle. He understood, I think, that information has its own pride and that it yields most readily to a respectful hand. He addressed a thin young archivist whose collar appeared too large for his neck. "We require the file relating to the Wetherby Clock Tower maintenance contract," said Holmes, "together with any tenders submitted within the last 5 years by Edmund Harrow of Clerkenwell or Jonathan Reed of Southwark. Also, any recorded correspondence between those parties lodged with the municipality." The young man blinked at the precision of the request, glanced nervously toward Lestrade's official presence, and then hurried away between the shelves. While we waited, Holmes stood near the window, his hands behind his back, watching the slow procession of people in the street below. He was silent, yet I could tell from the tension in his posture that his mind ran swiftly along invisible rails. Lestrade, who had accompanied us with obvious reluctance, fidgeted at the end of the table. "Paper and more paper," he muttered. "If the fellow's guilty, he's guilty, and these bundles won't alter it." Holmes did not turn. "They may alter everything, Inspector," he replied calmly. "The difference between a suspect and a murderer is often a single sheet of paper." The archivist returned at last with a bundle tied in string and stamped with the municipal seal. He placed it before Holmes with something like reverence, as though handing over a relic rather than a file. Holmes untied the string with the care one might use in unwrapping a delicate instrument. The first pages concerned routine matters: annual oiling, replacement of worn bearings, the purchase of dial glass, notes of minor stoppages during storms. Then came a thicker packet, newly inserted among the older papers, a formal tender, a committee report, and finally a contract stamped with authority. Holmes spread the contract flat upon the table and smoothed it with his palm. "Here," he said. The heart of the resentment. I leaned over his shoulder and read the pertinent clause. Edmund Harrow was granted exclusive maintenance rights to the Wetherby Clock Tower for a period of 5 years, with the option to renew upon satisfactory performance. The sum was substantial enough to transform a modest watchmaker's fortunes. Such a contract was not merely a matter of pride. It was security, influence, and access. "And Reed?" I asked. Holmes turned to the accompanying committee report. Jonathan Reed submitted a competing tender, rejected. The committee notes Harrow's lower bid and superior response capacity. It is, on its face, straightforward. Lestrade peered at the margins. Lower bid, meaning Harrow undercut him. "So it seems," Holmes said. "But undercutting is not, in itself, criminal. It is merely an irritant, like grit beneath the eyelid. In the right man, it produces tears. In the wrong one, it produces rage." He lifted the next sheet, which bore the heading "Correspondence," lodged in support of complaint. It contained letters exchanged between the two watchmakers, along with copies of a petition Reed had submitted to challenge the award. Holmes read the first letter rapidly, then the second, and then returned to the first again. The speed of his reading was astonishing, but more astonishing still was his capacity to extract not merely facts, but tone, those subtle inflections of pride, wounded vanity, and suppressed malice that no clerk's docket can truly conceal. Reed's letter, written in a sharp, disciplined hand, accused Harrow of questionable means and irregular procurement of materials. He suggested that Harrow's prices were inconsistent with honest trade, that inferior parts might endanger public timekeeping, and that the municipality had been misled by misrepresentation. The language was formal, but the bitterness beneath it was unmistakable. He was not merely protesting a contract, he was protesting an affront. Harrow's response was cooler, almost contemptuous. He dismissed Reed's accusations as the embittered complaints of a man unwilling to accept superior competence, and warned that any further insinuations would be met with legal action. Yet the very smoothness of Harrow's phrasing carried a sting. He wrote not like a man defending himself, but like a man confident that he held some advantage. Holmes placed the letters down in a neat stack, as one might set aside the pieces of a puzzle before attempting the picture. A motive forged in resentment, I observed. For the hostility in those lines was plain enough, Holmes nodded. But there was none of the satisfaction I had seen when he discovered a clean and decisive thread. His eyes remained thoughtful, unsettled even. Resentment, he replied, is as common in London as coal smoke. It blackens every surface and explains nothing until you know where the fire burns. These letters show anger, certainly. They show rivalry sharpened by money, but they do not yet show the particular shape of our crime. Lestrade drummed his fingers on the table. It shows enough. Harrow took Reed's livelihood. Reed had the tools, the knowledge, the chance. He's our man. Holmes's gaze lifted, and the faintest edge entered his voice. You are fond of simplicity, Inspector. It is an admirable instinct in a world that often punishes overthinking, but you must not confuse the easiest line with the true one. He drew one of Reed's pages closer and tapped it gently. Look not merely at what is written, Watson, but at what is not. I reread the complaint, frowning. He speaks of price undercutting, of questionable materials, of municipal negligence, but he does not speak of sabotage, nor of violence. Exactly, said Holmes. Reed is angry as a tradesman. He wishes to win a contract, or to ruin Harrow's reputation. If he were to act improperly, he would likely choose an act that supports his stated grievance, an incident that appears to confirm Harrow's incompetence, a clock that runs slow because of poor oiling, a stoppage caused by an inferior bearing, a failure that can be traced, plausibly, back to Harrow's workmanship. Lestrade shrugged, and the tower stopped. It stopped, Holmes agreed. But it stopped, like a pistol shot, public, dramatic, absolute, and the dial shattered in such a way as to draw every eye in the square upward. That is not the quiet vindictiveness of a commercial rival. It is performance. The word performance struck me with uncomfortable force, for it echoed my own impression of the scene. The great clock face, cracked like a broken eye, had seemed almost to stare down at us, demanding attention. Holmes's long fingers began to drum lightly on the paper, an unconscious habit when his mind pursued a difficulty. Consider also Harrow's tone, he continued. His threat of legal action is conventional, but there is something else, an implication that Reed himself is vulnerable. Harrow writes as if he possesses knowledge that makes him bold. You think he had something on Reed? I asked. It is possible, or he believed he did. Either way, it suggests an undercurrent beyond mere prices and contracts. Lestrade gave a short, skeptical laugh. Blackmail and bribery, perhaps. That's the sort of thing that would explain cheap parts. Perhaps, Holmes allowed. Yet blackmail does not shatter glass from within, nor does bribery produce a stoppage at a minute chosen with such precision. He gathered the letters, slid them back into their packet, and then paused as though a new thought had struck him. Tell me, he said to the archivist, who hovered nearby with anxious attention, is there any note of repairs to the clock face itself? Replacement of glass? Any unusual purchases? The young man consulted a separate ledger, thicker and older than the file, running his finger down columns with practiced speed. There was an order, he said. For a tempered glass panel some weeks ago, it was recorded under miscellaneous maintenance, delivered to Weatherby Tower and signed for by. One moment by Mr. Finch, the tower custodian. Holmes's eyes sharpened. Tempered glass, you say? Yes, sir. Holmes thanked him and closed the ledger with a decisive motion. Come, he said, we have read enough bitterness. Let us see what the clock face has to say for itself. It was late afternoon when we stood once more beneath Weatherby Clock Tower. The sky had lowered into a uniform grey, and the air was filled with a thin mist that clung to stone and coat alike. The square was quieter than the day before. A costermonger dozed beneath a canvas awning. Two clerks hurried past with collars turned up. Somewhere, a horse snorted, its breath a pale plume in the cold. Above us loomed the great dial, fractured and still. The hands remained fixed at 20 minutes past 9, defiant in their immobility. The shattered segments glittered faintly where moisture had collected along their edges. Holmes stood for a long time without speaking. He did not simply look at the clock. He studied it, his head tilted slightly, his gaze shifting minutely, as though aligning invisible angles. At last he walked several paces away from the base and turned to view the dial from the side. What are you doing? Lestrade demanded. Testing perspective, Holmes replied. If you wish to understand how a thing broke, you must first understand how it was meant to be seen. He moved again, 2 paces left, then right, until he found the point where the largest fracture aligned with the numeral 9. He stared upward, his face pale in the mist. Notice, he said at last, that the principal rupture lies just above the 9, not at the center. That suggests that the first failure occurred there. A stone could have struck it, Lestrade suggested. Holmes did not even glance at him. A stone from below would leave a different pattern. The fractures would radiate from the point of impact outward across the plane. Here, the break resembles a sudden outward burst. The shards are thrown forward and down, not inward. It is, in short, consistent with pressure from behind. I recalled our earlier observation inside the tower, internal pressure, I said. But from what? Holmes crouched and sifted through the debris in the gutter, where rainwater had washed the smallest fragments into a narrow channel. He lifted a shard and turned it between finger and thumb. This piece, he said, belongs to the original dial. The curvature matches the older glass. But this, he selected another, is subtly different. Its thickness varies by a fraction. Its edge is cleaner. It is newer. A replacement panel, I suggested. Holmes nodded. Or a patch. Lestrade scowled upward. So someone replaced part of the dial. That doesn't murder a man. It may, Holmes replied, if the replacement were done with intent. Consider. If one wished the glass to fail at a chosen moment, one might weaken a section, score it, replace it with inferior material, or introduce tension behind it. Then, at the desired minute, a concussive force from within could shatter it and produce a spectacle. The city would look up, the city would remember, the city would swear, in later testimony, that the clock declared a certain hour. Lestrade's impatience had begun to change into unease. He lowered his voice. You still think the clock was used to falsify time? I do, said Holmes quietly. Time is more than measurement, Inspector. It is authority. If the clock tower says it is 20 minutes past 9, then for the public mind it is 20 minutes past 9. Even if every private watch in London disagrees, people trust the big hand in the sky. He straightened, and his gaze traveled over the windows surrounding the square. And if one required witnesses who would later insist upon a particular time, he added, one could choose this spot. It is a natural place for eyes to rise. Clerks checking the hour, drivers timing deliveries, policemen noting their patrol. A single dramatic stoppage and a shattered face would lodge the minute into memory. I shivered, for the idea had a cold elegance to it, a crime committed not merely against a man, but against perception. And Harrow, I asked. Holmes's expression tightened. Harrow was an honest craftsman. He was granted the contract. Perhaps by merit, perhaps by advantage. He came to inspect the tower and found tampering. In such a case, he would have done what conscientious men do. He would have intended to report it. And then, Lestrade murmured, he fell. Holmes's eyes did not leave the dial. He did not merely fall, Holmes said softly. He was removed, either because he would not cooperate, or because he had already seen too much. The death served two purposes. It silenced him, and it added a human tragedy to the spectacle. A broken clock attracts attention. A dead watchmaker beneath it transforms attention into fascination. Lestrade stared at him. You make it sound as though the murderer wanted us to notice. Holmes turned at last to face him. In that moment, I saw something stern beneath his usual detachment. He did, said Holmes. That is why I am uneasy with your tidy conclusion that Jonathan Reed did it out of spite. Reed's anger is recorded in ink, and it is ugly enough. But the act itself, the shattered face, the exact minute, the mechanical instruction, has the feel of a mind not merely angry, but deliberate. It is a message. A message to whom? I asked. To anyone who needed the city to believe that time had been fixed, Holmes replied, and to anyone who might interfere. We stood in silence while the mist thickened, and the frozen hands remained obstinately unmoving above our heads. The tower's stone seemed to drink the light, growing darker as afternoon slid toward evening. Somewhere a distant bell rang, thin and melancholy, and I was struck by the irony that London's soundscape still marked the passing hours, while this great guardian of time remained halted in its chosen minute. Holmes drew from his pocket the pressed paper impression he had taken of the filing marks, along with the packet of bitter letters we had just examined. These, he said, holding them together, tell us what men felt: envy, pride, anger, humiliation. Useful, certainly, but the clock face tells us something else. What a mind dared to do with those feelings. He slipped the papers back into his coat and looked once more up at the shattered dial. Resentment alone does not explain shattered glass, Watson, he murmured. It explains the desire to wound, but not the artistry of the wound. This was theatrical, demonstrative. It was designed to be seen, to be remembered, to establish an hour as surely as any sworn statement. He took a step back, as though to regard the tower as a whole, the stone, the mechanism, the dial, the square beneath it. Somewhere, he said quietly, there is a second ledger, one not kept in the archive, a ledger of minutes and movements, of trains and appointments, of men who require time to be pliable. Until we find it, we will be chasing the bitterness of rival craftsmen while the true architect watches from the shadows. Lestrade drew his coat tighter. And what do you propose we do next? Holmes's eyes, still lifted, had that faraway brightness which signaled that his mind had already moved ahead of the question. We begin, he said, by treating the clock not as an object that failed, but as an instrument that was used. We examine who had access, who had reason to create a public memory of 20 minutes past 9, and who benefited from Harrow's silence. His gaze lowered at last to the cobblestones where the chalk outline had been, now blurred by rain. And we remember, he added, that when a crime is staged like a play, the audience is part of the design. With that, he turned away from the tower and began to walk, his tall figure soon swallowed by the mist. I followed at his side, feeling the weight of those bitter documents in my mind, not because they offered certainty, but because they revealed how easily human resentment could be enlisted by a colder, more calculating purpose. The archive had given us hostility in ink. The clock face had given us something worse, intention in glass and brass. And in the stubborn refusal of those hands to move beyond 20 minutes past 9, I sensed that the city itself had been made, however briefly, an accomplice to deception. Chapter V, the pattern in the glass twilight in London, does not merely dim the streets. It alters them, as though the city, relieved of its daytime obligations, permits the older shadows to step forward. The fog gathers with a deliberation that feels almost conscious. Gas lamps bloom into soft halos. Every window becomes a bright little secret. Every alley a question. It was at such an hour, when the wet stone of the pavements shone like darkened metal, and the air tasted of soot and rain. That Holmes rose from his chair in Baker Street with the brisk certainty that always signified a new turn in his thinking. "We must return to the tower," he said. I had become accustomed to these abrupt decisions. They were seldom impulsive. Holmes's mind, which appeared at times to wander idly, in truth moved along hidden tracks. And when it arrived at a conclusion, his body followed at once, as a well-trained instrument obeys the hand that guides it. "But we have examined it twice," I protested. "The mechanism, the filings, the wedge. What remains?" Holmes gathered his coat and took up his field lens, the compact glass he used when ordinary sight was too coarse a tool for the delicacy of his purpose. "Everything remains," he replied. "If we have only been looking at the wrong thing." The fog had thickened by the time we reached Wetherby Square. The tower rose above it like a dark mast above a pale sea. The great dial still held its stubborn pose, the hands fixed at 20 minutes past 9, unchanged since the night Edmund Harrow had been found dead beneath it. The shattered glass caught stray lamplight and returned it in small, cold glints. It had the unsettling effect of a broken eye, something once meant to watch over order now fractured into accusation. The square was quieter at this hour. A policeman paced his beat with patient regularity. 2 clerks hurried across the open space. Collars turned up, their glances lifted briefly to the dial before dropping again to the wet ground. A hansom rolled by with a hiss of wheels, its lamp a moving ember swallowed quickly by fog. Even the usual London sounds, calling voices, distant bells, the clatter of hooves, seemed softened, as if the city itself were reluctant to disturb the frozen minute above. Holmes did not linger over the cobblestones where the chalk outline had been, nor did he spare the maintenance ladder more than a passing glance. His attention rose instantly to the broken face. He walked to the center of the square and stopped, setting his feet with a care that seemed almost ceremonial. Then he lifted the field lens to his eye. For several minutes he remained wholly still. I have seen Holmes observe men in this fashion, apparently at ease, yet with every faculty sharpened. When he watched a suspect in a railway carriage or a nervous client in our sitting room, he had the same stillness, the stillness of a man who had ceased to be merely present and had become instead an instrument of perception. Now he watched not a man but glass, yet the intensity was identical. He lowered the lens at last and spoke without looking at me. "Walk with me." We moved nearer the base of the tower until the stone above us shut out much of the lamplight. Holmes lifted the lens again, and this time he adjusted his angle, holding it as a jeweler might hold a loupe. His gaze traveled slowly across the fracture lines. He shifted the lens a fraction, then another. His breathing remained even, but I could see the slight tightening at the corner of his mouth, the sign of concentration. "What do you see?" I asked. Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he held out the lens to me. "Look. And do not look as a man looks at damage. Look as an engineer looks at force." I raised the lens and peered upward. At first, the dial appeared as it had before, a web of cracks radiating from a central rupture above the numeral 9, with jagged gaps where pieces had fallen away. But magnification changed the matter. The fractures were not the haphazard lightning, bolts one expects when glass yields to a random blow. Certain lines were longer, cleaner, more commanding than the others. They did not simply scatter in all directions with equal violence. They seemed to favor a route, as though the glass, when it failed, had been encouraged to fail in a particular manner. One fissure in particular drew my eye, a broad, decisive crack that cut through the web like a road through tangled brush. It ran not downward toward the plaza, as I might have expected if impact or gravity had been the dominant influence. It angled unmistakably upward. Holmes's voice came close to my ear, low and controlled. "Observe the leading line." I lowered the lens and stared upward with unaided eyes. Once pointed out, the line could not be unseen. It guided the gaze away from the square and toward the darker upper structure of the tower, where the open slats of the belfry and the dim suggestion of rafters lay beyond. "It points up," I said, surprised at how instinctively my voice had dropped to a whisper. Holmes nodded, his eyes never leaving the dial. And does broken glass, Watson, naturally point upward? No, I admitted, a blow from below. I stopped, aware that the sentence itself was inadequate. Holmes's gloved hand traced an invisible path in the air, following the direction of the largest fissure. A common break, he murmured, will radiate out with the simple indifference of physics. But this is not common. The glass has yielded unevenly. The stress has traveled along a chosen route. The fracture has intention. Intention, I repeated. Holmes gave a faint, dry sound, not quite a laugh, but the acknowledgement of a word that was convenient even if imperfect. Not the intention of glass, the intention of the hand that prepared it. He moved a few paces to the right, then lifted the lens again. After a moment he moved left, then back to the center. Each time he studied the pattern anew, as though testing it against the changing perspectives of the square below. His movements were calm and exact, but beneath them I sensed urgency. An urgency not of speed but of certainty, as though a misreading of this clue would misdirect the whole investigation. At last he lowered the lens and turned slightly toward me. The supposed fall of debris cannot account for that symmetry, he said. If the glass was struck by something falling outward, stone, tool, a careless hand, then the dominant cracks would favor the outward direction. The weight of gravity would carry the violence down. Yet the leading fracture guides us in the opposite direction. Then what caused it? I asked. You have said before the glass broke from within. Holmes's expression sharpened. It did. But within the tower there is more than one within. We have been thinking in a single chamber clockface, mechanism square below. The fracture tells us that our map is incomplete. He tilted his head up once more, following the line to where darkness gathered behind the upper openings. Where does it point? To the belfry, I said slowly. Exactly. I felt a distinct chill at the implication. The belfry was above the clock chamber, a region of timber beams, ropes, bell supports, and shadowed ledges, spaces where dust and secrecy could settle for years undisturbed. It was not a place that citizens looked into. It was a place the tower itself concealed. Holmes spoke again, and his voice carried the quiet certainty that always signaled the moment when observation hardened into conclusion. The glass, he declared, is not merely broken, it is pointing. A gust of wind moved through the square, stirring the fog in pale ribbons. The lamps flared and dimmed. For an instant the fractured dial gleamed with a wet brilliance, like a wound-catching light. Holmes continued, as if arranging the argument step by step for my benefit. Consider what is required to create a public memory of time. One must stop the hands at a precise minute. One must attract attention to that stoppage. One must persuade witnesses, innocent, untrained witnesses, that the time they saw was true and memorable. A broken dial achieves that. It compels the eye upward. It makes the moment dramatic. It fixes an hour in the mind. And Harrow's death fixed it further, I said. Holmes's glance slid briefly to the cobblestones. Yes, a dead watchmaker beneath a stopped clock creates the kind of story the city repeats. People forget ordinary minutes. They do not forget a moment wrapped in spectacle. He raised the lens once more and studied the upper part of the dial, tracing the line with his gaze as though it were a finger pointing to a hidden shelf. But if one is staging a spectacle, he added, one must control more than the hands. One must control the break itself, where it begins, how it travels, what it suggests. How could anyone control glass breaking? I asked. Surely it shatters as it will. Holmes looked at me with mild reproach, as though I had asked whether a lock could be picked. Glass is honest, he said, but it is also obedient. Score it, weaken it, patch it with a different thickness. Introduce tension, do any of these, and you can persuade a pane to fail where you desire. A single prepared line will guide a fracture, like a rail guides a train. A train again, the thought returned of the Northern Express departing at 9:20. The bullion shipment, the need for an unquestioned minute. Everything in this affair seemed to circle back to that precise point in time, as though the city had been made briefly into an accomplice by simply believing what its own clock declared. Holmes stepped closer to the tower entrance and tested the handle. The constable on duty, recognizing him now, approached with a cautious respect. "I should like access above the clock chamber," Holmes said. The constable hesitated. "Above, sir. That's the belfry. Precisely. I'll have to fetch the custodian." Holmes's eyes remained lifted, fixed upon the dark openings near the top. "Do so," he replied. As the constable hurried away, Holmes spoke again, more softly, as though to himself. "The fracture begins above the 9, he said. "It favors the upward line. It suggests that the true act did not originate where we have been standing, but somewhere above, somewhere with vantage, concealment, and control." "And the murderer wanted us to think otherwise," I said. Holmes's mouth tightened faintly. "He wanted us to look at the square. At the ladder, at the rival across the river. He wanted us to accept the obvious direction of blame, but the glass contradicts him." He lifted his hand again, tracing the invisible trajectory. In that gesture, there was something almost eerie, the sense of a man reading an arrow, drawn not in ink, but in fracture. "The clock face," he murmured, "has been made into a signpost." The custodian arrived in due course, a stout, anxious fellow named Finch, carrying keys that clinked with every step. Holmes greeted him with his usual economy of words and requested passage upward. Finch protested that it was dangerous at night, that the belfry was cramped and full of ropes, that the bell mechanisms were old and treacherous. Holmes listened with patience, then answered with a calm firmness that made refusal unthinkable. "Danger is already in that tower," he said. "We merely intend to find its hiding place." And as the custodian unlocked the door and the stairwell yawned before us once more, its iron steps curling upward into shadow, I felt, with a certainty I could not justify by reason alone, that the investigation had turned. The frozen hands above were no longer the sole accusation. The glass itself, its cracks and angles and stubborn symmetry, had offered direction. It pointed unmistakably upward. Chapter VC, the hidden line, the interior of a clock tower by night, possesses a character unlike any other structure I have known. A church has its solemnity, a warehouse, its emptiness, a manor, its hush of human habit. But a tower built to mark the city's hours has, even when stilled, an air of latent command, as though it expects the world to obey its measure when its voice is silenced. The quiet is not peaceful. It is expectant. Finch, the custodian, led us upward with a lantern that threw a weak, wavering circle of light upon the stone. His bunch of keys clinked with each uneasy step. He protested in low tones as we climbed. "It's not safe, sir, truth be told. It's not meant for visitors at all." The bell ropes tangle. "The boards up there have been there since the tower was raised. And the dust, well, you'll be choking on it." Holmes listened with the indulgent patience one grants to a dog that barks at shadows. His mind, once fixed, moved through objections as a blade moves through cloth. "We shall be careful," he replied. "And you shall hold the lantern steady, Mr. Finch. That is all I require." We passed first through the clock chamber, where the great brass wheels waited like immobilized beasts. The wedge that Holmes had earlier discovered remained lodged between teeth, still holding the mechanism in its unnatural paralysis. Holmes glanced at it only long enough to confirm its position. Then his attention lifted higher, toward a narrow iron ladder that climbed through a hatch in the ceiling. "The belfry," Finch said, swallowing. "No one goes up unless a rope snaps." "Then tonight," Holmes returned, "we go up because a life has snapped." The hatch opened with a reluctant groan. A breath of colder air drifted down, carrying the dry smell of old timber and dust so thick it seemed almost tangible. Finch raised the lantern above his head, and its light revealed heavy beams crossing in darkness, ropes hanging in long vertical lines, and the vague curve of the bell's underside glimmering like dull bronze. Holmes climbed first, with a sure-footed ease that made my own ascent feel clumsy. Finch followed, murmuring half-formed prayers under his breath, and I brought up the rear. The moment my head rose above the hatch, the air changed. It was drier, colder, and filled with the faint metallic tang of aged iron. The belfry rafters were a world apart from the city below. Here the tower's public face, its dial and hands, was merely the thin skin of a larger body. The beams were massive, blackened by time. Dust lay upon everything in a thick, undisturbed coat, as if the years had settled gently and never been disturbed by ordinary maintenance. A spider's web, heavy with grit, trembled in the lantern's draught. Holmes stood very still, letting the light play across the timbers. "This is the place," he murmured. Finch shifted nervously. "It's only beams and ropes, sir." Holmes did not answer him. His gaze swept, not generally, but in sharp segments, beam to beam, rope to rope, peg to peg, like a man reading a coded message written in objects rather than words. He stepped forward onto a narrow plank that crossed the rafters, and the wood creaked under his weight. I felt suddenly aware of how high we were. The city's sounds were faint here, reduced to a distant murmur. The lantern's light seemed small against the darkness, pressing in from every corner. Holmes knelt and ran a gloved finger along the top of a beam. When he raised it, the glove was grey with dust. "Undisturbed," he said quietly. "No regular footfall, no recent sweeping." He moved again and then stopped. I saw nothing at first. The lantern light revealed only the familiar vertical ropes that operated the bell and the heavy wooden framework that supported it. Then Holmes lifted the lantern higher, angling it so the light struck along the grain of a beam rather than directly upon it. In that oblique illumination, a faint line became visible, so thin that it vanished when viewed straight on. "There," Holmes said. He reached out with the delicacy of a surgeon and touched the line between thumb and forefinger. It was a rope, yet not one of the thick bell ropes. This was far finer, more like a cord used for pulleys in small machinery. Against the dark timber, it was nearly invisible. Finch blinked in confusion. "That's not ours. We've no cord like that up here." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Just so." He drew the cord gently toward the lantern. Where the fibers twisted together, there were pale frays, fresh, bright against the older grime. The cord had been strained, not slowly, as ropes wear under ordinary use, but sharply, as a thing strains when it is forced to bear sudden weight. Holmes held the frayed portion near the flame, examining it with the intensity he might have given a bloodstain. "Fresh fibers," he observed, "and note the direction of pull, downward, then abruptly outward." "How can you tell that?" I asked. "The twist of the strands," he replied at once. "They have tightened unevenly. A rope remembers violence, Watson." He rose and followed the cord's path. It ran along the beam, passed through a small pulley fixed neatly into the timber, and then disappeared into shadow behind a crosspiece. Finch raised the lantern as high as he could, his hand trembling. Holmes stepped over a narrow gap between planks. One misstep would have meant a fall into the tower's hollow core, and continued along the cord with careful certainty. At last he reached the point where it ended, a concealed iron hook, newly screwed into a beam directly above the exterior frame of the clock face. Holmes leaned out slightly, peering down through a narrow opening between timbers. From this vantage one could see, far below and partially obscured, the back of the clock's dial assembly. Holmes straightened, his face briefly illuminated from below by the lantern's glow, and in his expression there was that hard satisfaction of a man who finds the hidden hinge on which a whole affair turns. "A suspended weight," he said quietly. Finch stared. "A weight? Up here?" Holmes nodded, and his voice, though low, carried that crisp explanatory clarity which always accompanied his deductions when they reached their decisive point. "Consider the requirements of the crime, Watson. First, the hands must halt precisely at 20 minutes past 9. That was achieved by the altered gear tooth, designed to jam at a calculated rotation. Second, the stoppage must be made memorable, public, dramatic. A silent halt alone might be missed by many. Therefore, the dial must be shattered at the same instant, forcing every witness to look up." He tapped the hidden hook with his gloved knuckle. This hook held a weight small but sufficient, suspended by this fine pulley line, positioned so that when released it would swing outward and strike the interior of the glass. "And the leading crack pointed upward," I murmured, remembering the directional pattern Holmes had traced. "Precisely," Holmes replied. The glass did not fail as glass fails when weakened by age. It failed as glass fails when struck from behind, at an angle chosen to guide the fracture. Finch licked his lips. But how would the weight release at the exact moment? Holmes's eyes flicked downward toward the clock chamber hatch below. The clock itself provided the timing, he said. The altered tooth ensured the gear locked at 20 minutes past 9, but a jam alone would not shatter the dial. Therefore, a second mechanism must have been linked to that jam, something that responded when tension in the system suddenly changed. He moved back along the cord and pointed to the pulley. Observe the pulley's placement. It allows the cord to run down toward the clock mechanism and then up again, turning force into direction. When the gear jammed, the sudden resistance would create a jerk in the framework. Minute, but enough to trigger a catch, a slip knot, or a release pin. The weight would drop, swing, and strike. I imagined it vividly. The moment the minute hand reached its appointed place, the gear tooth caught, the entire mechanism jolted, and above, in the belfry's darkness, a concealed weight released like a pendulum of violence. And Harrow, I asked, where does he fit into this arrangement? Holmes's face tightened slightly. Harrow ascended to inspect, he said. He may have seen the altered tooth. He may have noticed the additional cord if he had reason to look upward, but the perpetrator could not risk his reporting it. If Harrow was on the ladder when the gear jammed and the dial shattered, the sudden concussion and burst of glass would startle any man. A single moment of disorientation, one slip, and gravity completes the work. Finch shuddered. So he wasn't pushed. Holmes's gaze was steady. It is possible he was, but it may not have been necessary. A well-planned crime often relies on human reflex, rather than brute strength. He crouched again and examined the dust along the plank. Here, he said. He pointed to a faint disturbance, a smear where dust had been brushed aside, and beside it, the clear imprint of a boot sole. Finch stared. That's recent. Very, Holmes replied. You told us no one comes up here unless a rope snaps. Yet someone stood here, near the hook, within the last day. Lestrade was not with us in the belfry, yet I could almost hear his gruff satisfaction at the notion of evidence. But Holmes's expression remained thoughtful, not triumphant. This is proof of method, he said, not yet proof of identity. He examined the imprint closely, noting the pattern of the sole. A common workman's boot, he remarked. Not a gentleman's shoe, and, interesting, there is a small nick in the outer tread, a missing segment that will narrow our search. Finch's voice was small. Who would do such a thing? Up here. Holmes looked past him, down into the tower's depths, as though he could see through stone and iron to the city beyond. A man who needed time to testify falsely, he said. A man who required the public to swear that it was 20 minutes past 9, because elsewhere, far from this square, another act depended upon that minute being unquestioned. I felt again the cold touch of that earlier speculation, the Northern Express, the bullion, and the strange insistence of the frozen hands. The tower was no longer merely the scene of a death. It was an instrument in a larger design. Holmes took the cord between his fingers once more. Note also, he added, how fine this line is. It is not an ordinary bell rope. It is designed to be easily concealed and easily cut away after use. And yet, our perpetrator left it. Why would he? I asked. Holmes's eyes narrowed, either because he believed no one would look here, or because he wished us to look. He let the cord fall back against the beam, where it vanished once more into darkness. The clock face, he murmured, was not merely broken. It was made to point upward, to this very place. He straightened, and though his posture remained composed, there was in him the sharpened energy of a man who has found the hidden hinge of a puzzle. We have our mechanism, he said quietly. Now we must find the hand that set it. As we descended, Finch clutched the lantern as though it were a charm against the tower's darkness below. The arrested brass gears waited in silence, indifferent to the human life they had helped to end. Yet to me they no longer seemed inert. They seemed complicit, parts of a deliberate lie. And above, in the belfry rafters, that nearly invisible line hung in the dust, like a confession written too faintly for ordinary eyes. Chapter 7: A demonstration of force. It was characteristic of Holmes that discovery in his hands was never permitted to remain a mere sensation of triumph. To find the hidden line in the belfry rafters was, for him, not an ending but a beginning. An opening of the locked box, which must then be emptied, sorted, and its contents arranged until each object lay in its proper place, where another man might have exclaimed and hurried away to make an arrest. Holmes grew quieter, more exacting, as though the presence of a solution increased rather than diminished his sense of responsibility. We returned to Baker Street late that night with dust upon our coats and the smell of old timber still clinging to our hands. The fog outside had turned colder. It pressed against the windows in pale sheets. Holmes said little as he sat at the table, drew the lamp closer, and began to sketch. The first page held a rough outline of the tower, its square base, the clock chamber, the belfry above. Upon the second, he drew the clock mechanism itself, reproducing from memory the relationship of wheel to wheel with astonishing accuracy. Then, on a third sheet, he added the concealed pulley line and its hook, placing it precisely where we had found it. Only when the diagram was complete did he speak. "Now, Watson," said he, "we shall remove the last refuge of uncertainty." I had learned that when Holmes spoke in such a tone, he meant not to persuade by rhetoric, but to compel by logic. He pinned his sketches beneath the lamp and began to indicate each element with the tip of his pencil. "First, the altered gear tooth," he said. Its filing was not careless, but engineered. It ensured that at a designated rotation, computed from the winding schedule and gear ratios, the tooth would meet its mate with insufficient clearance. Friction would increase beyond tolerance. The wheel would hesitate, then seize, the whole movement would arrest. He tapped the diagram lightly. Second, the wedge, not the cause of the stoppage, but its guarantee. Once the gear locked, the wedge prevented any rebound or partial movement, and held the hands fixed at precisely 20 minutes past 9. "And so the time became a statement," I observed. "Exactly," he replied, "a public instrument declaring an hour." Holmes's pencil moved upward in the diagram toward the belfry. Third, the concealed line. Here lies the artistry of the crime. The fracture pattern on the glass pointed upward. The line explains why. A fine pulley cord, nearly invisible in the darkness, ran from a concealed hook above the clock's exterior frame. Suspended from it was a weight, small, dense, and positioned, so that when released it would swing outward and strike the interior surface of the dial. I recalled the pale fraying fibers, bright as new bone against old dust. "Fresh strain," I said. Holmes nodded. Violent tension, a sudden jerk, not a gradual load. He leaned back in his chair, eyes half closed, and for a moment I thought he might fall into one of his peculiar reveries. But the pause was only the gathering of his thoughts. "The question," he continued, "is how the release was timed. The perpetrator required the weight to fall at the exact instant the hand stopped. If it fell too soon, the dial might break while the hand still moved, and the minute would be lost. If too late, the dramatic linkage between stoppage and shattering would be weakened. And he accomplished it by linking the line to the jam," I asked. Holmes's eyes opened, not directly to the jam perhaps, but to the change in tension produced by it. Consider, in a running clock, force is steady, weights descend, gears turn, resistance is constant. But when the mechanism seizes unexpectedly, the stored energy has nowhere to go. It expresses itself as a momentary shock through the frame. He pointed to his sketch again. "A catch, Watson. Something small. A pin, a slip, not a trigger hook. It could have been fixed here, where the line met the pulley. Under ordinary motion, it would hold. Under sudden jerk, it would release. The weight, once freed, would swing outward on its arc and strike the glass from behind at an angle. Precisely the angle the fracture pattern revealed. It was all so coldly coherent that despite the warmth of the lamp, I felt again the chill which comes when one sees human ingenuity applied to cruelty." Holmes placed his pencil down and stood, pacing slowly. "Now we come to the fourth and most human element, Edmund Harrow. The name, spoken in Holmes's voice, carried neither sentiment nor detachment, but something sterner. An acknowledgement of a life reduced to a variable in an equation. You said earlier, I reminded him, that Harrow might have been startled, thrown off the ladder by the sudden burst. Holmes stopped and faced me. I said it might not have been necessary to push him, he replied. But I did not say that he simply happened to be there. He returned to the table and took up a fourth sheet of paper. Upon it he drew the outline of the tower's base and the ladder's position relative to the dial. Then he marked a small figure upon the rungs, Harrow's place. Think, Watson, he said softly. A man does not climb to repair the face of a great clock at night, in rain without reason. The municipal schedule, according to Finch, sets inspections in daylight. Yet Harrow was beneath the dial after 9 o'clock. Then he was summoned, I said. Holmes inclined his head. Or lured, or compelled. He tapped the drawn figure with his pencil. Harrow had to be present to complete the tableau. A broken clock alone is interesting. A dead watchmaker beneath it is irresistible. The story writes itself. An honest craftsman meets misfortune while tending the public timepiece. The city will accept it as readily as it accepts the hour displayed above. But why place him there at that precise moment? I asked. Holmes's eyes narrowed. Because, he replied, his presence performs two functions. It silences the one man likely to recognize tampering, and it supplies the human element necessary to fix the false time into the memory of witnesses. I frowned, struggling with the implication. You mean, I said slowly, Harrow's death was part of the timing. Holmes's answer was quiet. He did not fall, said he. He was waiting. The words, spoken so calmly, struck with a force I can scarcely describe. Holmes had often uttered grim conclusions in a matter of fact tone, yet this one carried a particular weight. It transformed the image of Harrow from a man unlucky upon a wet ladder to a man deliberately placed like a figure on a chessboard. How can you be sure? I demanded. Holmes did not bristle at my challenge. He welcomed it, as he always did when the question was honest. Because of what we saw at the base of the tower, he replied. The ladder was undisturbed, no skid marks, no broken rung. The chalk outline showed Harrow did not land sprawled as a man does when he tumbles unpredictably. His body position, according to the constable's notes, suggested a fall that began from a particular angle. And remember the fragments of his loop. The thicker glass? I asked. No, his own lens. A watchmaker would not keep it in his hand while climbing. It would remain in his pocket, safe, yet it was smashed near the point of impact. That suggests he had it out. Why? Because he was examining something. The clock face, I ventured, or something behind it, Holmes replied. A man intent on routine maintenance does not use his loop upon a large glass dial. He uses it upon a detail, a filing, a wedge, a line. He was looking for what had been altered. That implies he suspected alteration. He paced again, hands clasped behind his back. And how would he come to suspect it? Holmes went on. Somebody told him. Someone drew him there at that hour with a plausible reason. Perhaps a message. The clock had been behaving oddly, stopping briefly, making a sound. Perhaps an urgent request. The morning's timetable depended upon accurate timekeeping. Harrow, conscientious and proud of his contract, would respond, even at night. And once he was there, I began. Once he was there, Holmes finished. The rest could proceed. The mechanism jammed at 20 minutes past 9. The line released. The weight struck and burst the glass outward. The concussion, the sudden spray of fragments, the shock of sound. Even the bell above may have groaned from the vibration, would startle any man on a ladder. If he had been leaning in, examining, his balance would already be compromised. A slip, an involuntary jerk away from flying shards, and he would fall. Lestrade's earlier theory of pure accident rose in my mind, now revealed as a crude shadow of the truth. So the debris, I said, and the damage made it look like the glass failed, and he fell with it. Holmes nodded. A spectacle that supplies its own explanation. He returned to the table and placed a finger on the point in his diagram. where the hook lay above the exterior frame. Note also the fracture direction. The leading fissure angled upward toward the belfry rafters. That is not a happenstance of physics. It is the handwriting of force. The glass was struck from within, from above and slightly to one side. The weight swinging outward from the hook would create precisely that. He looked up at me, his expression composed but intent. That is the reconstruction. Now we must address the one question which persists beneath it, like a stone under clear water. I knew the question without his speaking it. Who, I said, arranged it? Holmes sat again, and for a moment his face, usually so controlled, betrayed a faint tension. Jonathan Reed, he said, possesses motive. The contract dispute, the bitterness in the municipal letters, the matching file marks. These are significant. He is a watchmaker with the skill to file a gear tooth to a calculated tolerance. And yet, I said, recalling Holmes's earlier unease, it feels too neat. Holmes's thin smile returned, humorless. Too neat, he agreed, and more than that, too informed. The placement of the hook, the concealment of the line, the knowledge of rafters and access boards. This suggests intimate familiarity with the tower's structure. Reed could have visited, I suggested. At night. He could, Holmes admitted. But could he have done so without leaving a more obvious trail? And would he risk climbing into a belfry thick with dust and bell ropes without practice? A man may know clocks yet still be clumsy among beams and heights. Holmes's gaze drifted toward the window, where fog pressed against the glass like a living thing. There is another possibility, he said softly. A man who knows the tower, not as a tradesman knows a mechanism, but as an inhabitant knows a house. The custodian? I asked sharply, startled by my own thought. Holmes raised a hand. Not Finch. He is anxious in every fiber, but someone employed there, perhaps. Someone with access to keys, to schedules, to the quiet times when no one watches, or someone who worked upon the tower during construction or repair. And such a person might lend tools, I said, or steal them. Holmes's eyes glinted. Now you are beginning to see the shape of it. The file marks point to Reed's shop. The tower knowledge points elsewhere. The crime has two faces, the mechanical alteration and the structural staging. They may belong to one mind, or to two. A partnership, I murmured. Holmes nodded once. Or a manipulation. A clever architect may plant suspicion upon a rival, leaving a signature file pattern where it will be found, while the true arrangement is executed by another hand. He leaned forward, voice low. The more intricate the tableau, Watson, the more likely it required access and confidence. Reed's motive is clear, yes, but motive is the coarsest of clues. The method speaks in finer language. I sat in silence, absorbing the cold logic. In my mind's eye, I saw again the tower at 20 minutes past 9, the hands halting, the glass bursting outward, the sudden gasp of passers. By Harrow's startled movement and fall, an entire drama compressed into a single minute, constructed with the precision of an engineered device. Holmes rose, extinguished the lamp, and stood for a moment in the dimness where only the fire's glow outlined his face. We have our mechanism, he said quietly. We have our reconstruction. Tomorrow we find the men whose lives required that minute to be manufactured. He turned toward his chemical table, already reaching for some paper and reagents, and I knew the case had entered its more perilous phase. For when Holmes ceased to ask how a crime was done and began instead to ask who needed it done, the investigation moved inevitably from objects to men, and from deduction to confrontation. Outside, London continued to breathe in fog and lamp. Light somewhere, railway wheels turned in darkness. Schedules were kept, deliveries timed, and transactions made upon the assumption that time itself was honest. At Wetherby Tower, the hands still refused to move beyond 20 minutes past 9. And somewhere in the city, a mind that had dared to instruct a clock to lie waited to see whether Sherlock Holmes would read the lesson written in shattered glass. Chapter the 8th A. The apprentice's silence in all my experience with Holmes. I have observed that the most dangerous moment in an investigation is not when one faces a violent man, but when one approaches a timid one. The violent are at least consistent. They act as their nature compels them. The timid, by contrast, are capable of astonishing departures, of betrayals committed not from malice but from fear, of crimes performed not from hatred but from the desperate wish to be liked, forgiven, restored. They are, in short, the most unpredictable of creatures, for they are forever being driven by forces outside themselves. Holmes had slept little after his reconstruction of the clock tower event. At breakfast, his eyes were brighter than usual, his movements quick and restrained, his mind evidently pursuing some thread invisible to me. He had spoken the night before of the likelihood that the crime demanded two kinds of knowledge: the precision of a watchmaker and the intimate confidence of someone accustomed to the tower's upper reaches. Yet he had refused to settle upon any single name. Instead, he asked questions, quiet, probing questions, about access. Who, he murmured as he poured his coffee, could pass from Reed's shop to Harrow's without remark? Who could handle tools in one place, then appear innocent in the other? Who could hear bitterness in one ear and duty in the other? I thought at once of journeymen, of errand boys, of those humble bridges between one master and another. When I said as much, Holmes looked up sharply. Exactly, Watson, the invisible men. Lestrade arrived mid-morning with information of his own. Jonathan Reed, he reported, had grown more agitated since our visit and had taken to pacing his shop late into the evening. Yet no direct proof tied him to the tower beyond the file marks. He's nervous, Lestrade insisted. That's as good as guilt. It is as good as fear. Fear is not evidence, Inspector, but the file. The file may be a signpost, Holmes replied, or it may be bait. We require something that cannot be explained away by coincidence. He rose abruptly, coat in hand. Come, Watson. We went first to Clerkenwell, to Harrow's workshop. It had been sealed after the death, but Lestrade's authority secured us entry. The familiar smell of oil and metal greeted us. The benches stood as Harrow had left them, his half-disassembled pocket watch still laid out with meticulous care, a silent testament to a man who believed in order. Holmes moved to the far corner where a smaller bench stood, less polished, less organized. There lay rougher tools, scraps of brass, a few broken springs. It was the apprentice's place. Name? Holmes asked the constable on duty. Samuel Clark, sir, the man replied. Timid young fellow, 17, perhaps 18. He's been questioned, but he barely speaks above a whisper. Said he was at home when it happened. Holmes's eyes narrowed. And when did he enter Harrow's employment? About 8 months back, after working elsewhere. The constable nodded. I heard he was with Reed before that. Across the river, changed masters during the contract dispute, so folks say. Holmes did not speak for a moment. He simply stood, gazing at the apprentice's bench, as though the scattered filings and imperfect work might spell out the boy's heart. Unrestricted access, he murmured. Both shops, 2 masters, and a mind eager to please. He straightened. Where does Clark lodge? The address was supplied, and within the hour, we stood before a narrow house in a cramped street off Gray's Inn Road. The place had the shabby respectability of working London. Curtains patched, steps worn, a child's voice somewhere above. Holmes mounted the stair and knocked without waiting for permission. A woman opened the door, a worn, faced landlady who looked suspiciously at Lestrade's presence and anxious at Holmes's lean intensity. Holmes explained that he wished only to speak with her lodger. Samuel, she called upward. There's gentleman to see you. A slow step sounded, then another. Samuel Clark appeared at the top of the stairs and descended with the hesitancy of a boy who expects rebuke. He was slight, pale, with hair that fell untidily across his forehead. His eyes darted first to Lestrade, then to Holmes, then away again as though he could escape by refusing to meet their gaze. Mr. Clark, Holmes said gently, you were apprenticed to Mr. Harrow. Yes, sir, the boy whispered, and before that, to Mr. Reed. Samuel's shoulders tightened, only for a time. Holmes nodded, as though this were of no great significance. He spoke softly, almost kindly. You have had an unfortunate week, a master dead, and questions asked of you. I should like to spare you further distress, but truth requires clarity. Samuel swallowed. I told the police what I knew. Holmes's gaze drifted apparently, casually, to the boy's hands. It was a small movement, but I had seen it before. The sudden sharpening of attention, the slight stillness as though Holmes's mind had found purchase. Samuel's left hand was half, hidden behind his body, his fingers curled inward. Holmes extended his own hand. May I see your palm? Samuel jerked as if struck. Why? Because, Holmes replied calmly. You have been hurt. The boy's breathing quickened. His hand emerged reluctantly. Across the center of the palm ran a faint abrasion, reddened and raw, as though a cord had bitten into the skin. It was not the clean cut of a knife, nor the scrape of a fall. It was the unmistakable mark of friction, of rope sliding under tension. A rope burn, I murmured. Samuel's eyes widened. He snatched his hand back, but the motion was too late. Holmes's voice remained gentle, yet there was iron beneath it. Mr. Clark, he said, no watchmaker's apprentice receives such a wound at a bench. You have handled a line under strain recently. Samuel's face drained of color. His gaze flicked desperately to the landlady, who hovered behind the door with alarmed curiosity, and then back to Holmes. I caught it on a crate, he stammered. Holmes sighed softly, as one does when a child insists the broken vase fell unaided from the shelf. A crate does not produce a long, smooth burn across the center of the palm, he replied. A rope does, and the only rope of consequence in this investigation hangs in the belfry rafters above Weatherby Clock Tower. Samuel's lips parted, but no sound came. Lestrade stepped forward, impatience returning. Out with it, lad. We've had enough nonsense. The boy's composure, already fragile, began to fracture. He trembled visibly now, his shoulders rising and falling with quick breaths. It was as though Holmes's quiet certainty had stripped away whatever thin defense he possessed. Holmes spoke again, more softly. Did Mr. Reed send you to the tower? Samuel shook his head violently. No, he never said. Holmes's eyes narrowed slightly. He never said what? Samuel's breath hitched. He pressed his injured palm against his chest, as though holding it could hold his confession back. Holmes took a step closer. You were in both shops during the contract negotiations, he said. You heard Mr. Reed's complaints. You saw Mr. Harrow's satisfaction. You wished to remain useful, perhaps to both, or perhaps you wished to return. Samuel's eyes filled suddenly, not with anger, but with shame. He was kind to me, the boy burst out. Mr. Reed, before he taught me. And then he lost the city work, and he was different. Bitter, he said Mr. Harrow stole it. He said he'd be ruined. Holmes's gaze remained steady, and you wished to help him. Samuel's voice collapsed into a whisper. He didn't ask. Not truly. He spoke. He said, if the city could see Harrow's work fail, if the tower clock stopped, if people complained, maybe they'd take the contract back. He said Harrow's prices were impossible, that he must be cheating, and that someone ought to show the committee what sort of man he was. Lestrade made an impatient sound. So you took it upon yourself. Samuel flinched. Holmes did not press with anger. He pressed with inevitability. You filed the gear, Holmes said quietly. Samuel's lips moved soundlessly, then he nodded once. Tinny broken, and you rigged the pulley line in the belfry, Holmes continued. Samuel's knees seemed to weaken. He leaned against the wall, eyes squeezed shut. I didn't mean, he whispered. I didn't mean to kill him. I thought it would only stop the clock, make it look like his maintenance was poor. That's all. I thought it would be. A scandal, not. His voice failed. Holmes's expression, for perhaps the first time in the case, showed something like sorrow, not sentimental, but severe. "You believed you were merely bending reputation," he said. "But you were bending time itself." Samuel looked up, tears on his cheeks. "The weight," he stammered. "I didn't know it would break so badly. I didn't know he'd be there." Holmes's eyes sharpened. "You did not know Harrow would be at the tower." "I did it the day before. I went up when Finch was out, when the bell ropes were being checked and no one watched. I rigged it quick. I thought it would happen in daylight when he came to inspect. But when evening came and nothing had happened, I panicked. I sent him a note, anonymous, saying the clock was behaving strangely and must be seen to at once. I didn't think." Holmes held up a hand. "And yet he was there at night. He covered his face with his bandaged hand. It was my note that brought him there. I wrote that the clock was behaving strangely and must be seen to at once. I thought only to disgrace him, not to kill him." Holmes turned his head slightly toward me, and in that glance I saw the case widen again. The apprentice had confessed to the mechanics, yet a crucial element remained unexplained: who had lured Harrow to the ladder at the fatal moment? Lestrade seized upon the confession like a man grabbing a rope. "That's enough," he said. "You'll come with us." Samuel collapsed into sobbing, his whole body shaking. Holmes, however, remained very still. "Mr. Clark," he said gravely, "you have told us how time was forced, but tell me, did Mr. Reed ever handle the file? Did he ever instruct you?" Samuel shook his head. "Number. He only talked. He only complained. I thought, if I did it, he'd see I was loyal, that he'd take me back." Holmes's face hardened, not with anger at the boy, but with condemnation of the chain of human weakness that had led to death. "Time was forced," he said quietly, "and so was destiny." Samuel stared at him, bewildered, as if he had expected shouting and found only judgment of a stranger kind. Holmes continued, his voice precise. "You sabotaged the gear to ensure stoppage at 20 minutes past 9. You rigged the pulley line so a weight would strike the glass outward at the same instant, making the stoppage memorable. You believed the spectacle would disgrace Harrow and restore Reed. Instead, you provided the conditions for Harrow's death." Samuel whispered. "I didn't want him dead." "No," Holmes replied. "You wanted approval, which is often more dangerous than hate." Lestrade was already ordering a constable to take the boy away. The landlady watched with her apron pressed to her mouth, aghast as we descended to the street. The fog closed around us like a curtain. Samuel Clark's confession had illuminated much, yet not all. The method was now confessed, the motive partially revealed, and Reed's bitterness explained. But the message that summoned Harrow to the tower at night remained a shadow on the edge of the lantern light. Holmes walked beside me in silence for several minutes. At last he spoke. "The apprentice's silence," he said, "was not the silence of innocence, Watson. It was the silence of fear, but fear seldom acts alone. Someone, somewhere, understood enough to set Harrow on that ladder at precisely the minute the clock was instructed to lie." "And Reed?" I asked. Holmes's eyes were hard in the mist. "Reed's motive is clear," he said. "But motive does not pull ropes in rafters. We shall see how much he truly knows." The case, which had seemed to narrow, had instead sharpened into something more precise, a crime engineered by a boy's weakness, yet perhaps guided by a darker hand. Chapter I, Fay, The Rival's Fall, the confession of Samuel Clark, wrung from him less by Lestrade's bluster than by Holmes's quiet inevitability, did not end the affair so much as it changed its temperature. One detail remained imperfectly lit: whether Reed himself had sent the urgent summons that brought Harrow to the tower, or whether some intermediary had done so on his behalf. But for Holmes, the legal and moral center of the matter no longer depended upon that distinction. Clark had admitted not only the sabotage of the mechanism, but that Reed had caused an urgent summons to be sent to Harrow on the fatal night, ensuring that the watchmaker would be upon the ladder when the clock was instructed to lie. A single timid youth, capable of ruinous action in the name of favor, explained the hand that filed the gear and the fingers that tied the line. Yet it did not fully satisfy the cold intelligence of the crime. Clark had now admitted both the sabotage and the urgent summons that brought Harrow to the ladder. But one must still ask who supplied the design with its moral permission, who planted in a pliant mind the idea that time itself could be bent to commercial revenge. Holmes, having listened to the boy's halting admission, had not indulged in any of the triumph which Lestrade so often expected. The exact hand that penned the urgent summons might remain uncertain. The design itself did not. Harrow had been brought to the ladder because the sabotage required a witness, victim, and Reed's incitement had furnished both motive and direction. He had merely nodded, as a mathematician nods when a long calculation yields a number that confirms what he already suspected. Then he had begun at once to gather the next necessities: papers, tools, witnesses, everything required to remove the case from the realm of clever inference and place it within the harsh machinery of law. By evening we were again crossing the river, the Thames moving beneath us like a strip of black cloth, and the winter rain returning in fine needle, like threads. Reed's shop stood bright against the gloom, its gilded chronometer sign glinting in the lamplight as though stubbornly proud of its own accuracy. The bell above the door chimed when we entered, a sound almost mocking in its cheerfulness. Jonathan Reed looked up from behind his counter, with the wary expression of a man who has spent 2 days expecting the knock that will end his freedom. He had the air of one prepared for assault, jaw set, shoulders squared, pride standing like a shield before him. Holmes did not waste words. "Mr. Reed," he said, "you have denied any involvement in the events at Weatherby Tower. I have come to offer you the opportunity to maintain that denial if you can." Reed's eyes flicked to Lestrade, then to the constables who waited near the door. "I have done nothing," he said stiffly. "You are harassing an honest tradesman." Holmes's gaze did not move from Reed's face. "Honesty," he replied, "is a matter that leaves traces. Let us examine yours." He produced from his pocket the pressed paper impression of the filing marks and the thin, staggered file we had previously inspected. He placed them upon the counter with the exactness of a man laying out surgical instruments. "You recognize this file?" Reed's mouth tightened. "It is mine, I told you so. And you stated it has not left this shop in months." "It has not." Holmes did not argue, he merely opened a second packet and removed a small glass vial. Inside were a few pale fibers, frayed and bright against the glass. "These fibers," Holmes said, "were taken from a pulley line concealed in the belfry rafters above the Weatherby clock face. They are fresh. They show violent strain." Beard's eyes narrowed, though a faint color rose along his cheekbones. "I know nothing of any rope." Holmes inclined his head, as though granting him that statement its momentary dignity. "And yet," he continued, "Samuel Clark knows a great deal about rope." At the name, Reed's composure shifted, only a fraction. But Holmes's attention caught it instantly, as a lens catches light. "Clark is a fool," Reed said sharply. "A weak boy. I dismissed him because he had no steadiness." "Indeed," Holmes replied, "and he wished very much to regain your approval." Reed's eyes flashed. "If he has done something foolish, it is his affair, not mine." Holmes's voice remained mild. "That would be more convincing if your words to him had been less suggestive." He produced a third packet. Letters copied from municipal records and supplemented by correspondence Holmes had quietly obtained from the boy's lodgings. Reed stared at them with the faint alarm of a man who sees his own handwriting lifted like a mirror. Holmes selected one and read a few lines, no more than necessary to convey the spirit. "You wrote of Harrow's false balance and how it might be restored. You spoke of mechanical correction. A curious phrase, Mr. Reed, for a man engaged merely in lawful complaint." Reed's nostrils flared. "It is metaphor, is it?" Holmes asked softly. He laid the letter down and stepped closer to the counter, his eyes, grey, clear, inexhaustibly attentive. Whereupon Reed, with a pressure more difficult to resist than any shouted accusation. "Metaphor is the tool of men who wish to speak without being held to account," Holmes continued. "You did not order Clark to file a gear. You did not command him to climb into rafters, but you fed him the idea that something must be corrected, that balance must be restored, that Harrow's success was an injustice." Reed's hands clenched. "Harrow did cheat. He undercut honest trade. Holmes cut him off with a single raised finger. Harrow may have undercut you, he said, but you undercut truth. You created in a malleable mind the notion that sabotage was justice. You let him believe he would be rewarded for disloyalty to his present master and loyalty to you. Your Reed's face darkened. You cannot prove that. Holmes turned slightly, and I saw he had been waiting for those words. On the contrary, he said. He nodded once to the constable at the door. The man stepped aside, and Samuel Clark was led in pale, trembling, his injured palm bandaged. The boy's eyes darted to Reed with a desperate mixture of fear and longing, as if even now he sought some sign that his sacrifice had not been worthless. Reed stared at him with contempt. "You little rat." Clark flinched as though struck. Holmes's voice became colder. "Samuel Clark will testify," he said, "that you repeatedly lamented your ruined livelihood in his presence, that you spoke not merely of lawful complaint, but of making Harrow's work fail in public, and of forcing the committee to see his true competence. He will further testify that, on the fatal evening, you caused an urgent summons to be sent to Harrow, so that he should be present when the mechanism failed. Clark will testify that he believed he was acting to restore your standing, and that he expected your approval." Reed's jaw worked, but no words came. Holmes continued with the methodical precision of his final proofs. "You possess the file whose distinctive cut matches the marks on the altered gear tooth. Clark admits he used a file of that pattern. You deny it left your shop, yet Clark had access here when he worked for you. And he had access after, by his own admission. When he came seeking your favor, he borrowed it, or stole it briefly, believing you would not object." Reed's eyes flicked away. Holmes lifted the small vial again. "The pulley fibers match a fine cord of a type, sold by the same supplier from whom you purchase specialist materials. Your ledger records such a purchase. That alone is not proof, but it confirms familiarity, procurement, and opportunity." Reed's shoulders sank almost imperceptibly, as though the structure of defiance had begun to loosen at its joints. "And finally," Holmes said, "the tower itself. The staging required intimate knowledge of the belfry's rafters, the placement of beams, and the hidden angle from which a weight could strike the dial to produce a fracture pattern that pointed upward. Clark admits he climbed into those rafters. He did it to disgrace Harrow, yes, but the idea that disgrace could be engineered by mechanical correction was planted in him by you." Your Reed's mouth twisted. "You speak as though words are crimes." Holmes's reply was very quiet and very sharp. "Words are the beginning of crimes," he said, "especially when spoken to a boy who wants to belong." For a moment, Reed stood rigid, his face strained. Then, as though the last inner screw had stripped, his defiance collapsed into something weary and bitter. "He stole my livelihood," Reed muttered. Holmes's expression did not soften. "You sought to steal more than that," he said. "You sought to steal the public's trust, the city's time, and a man's life." Lestrade stepped forward then, satisfaction and grim relief mingling in his features. "That's enough," he said. "Jonathan Reed, you are under arrest for incitement and conspiracy in connection with the death of Edmund Harrow." Reed did not struggle. The fight had gone out of him, replaced by a bleak resignation. As the constables took his arms, he looked not at Lestrade, nor at Holmes, but at Samuel Clark. "You thought I'd thank you," he said, voice thick with contempt. "You thought I'd take you back." Clark's lips trembled. I only wanted." Reed turned away, as if ashamed to acknowledge the very weakness he had exploited. Holmes watched the exchange without visible emotion. Yet when we stepped outside into the rain, he spoke to me in a voice I had seldom heard from him. Quiet, measured, and touched with something like moral fatigue. "A boy may be forgiven for wanting approval," he said. "A man cannot be forgiven for using that want as a lever." That night the formal proceedings moved swiftly, for the law, once given a structure of evidence, is less patient than the imagination. Clark's confession established the mechanical acts, the filing, the rigging, the weight. Reed's correspondence and the testimony established the atmosphere of incitement. the poisonous suggestion that sabotage was justice and that ruin could be restored by force. Together they formed a chain, motive spoken, act performed, consequence fatal. The authorities claimed both men, one for manipulation, the other for execution of the fatal design. Clark was led away in tears, Reed in silence. Each bore the punishment of his own nature, the boy crushed by remorse, the man hardened by bitterness. Holmes and I returned once more, before the matter was fully closed, to Weatherby Square. It was late, and the rain had eased into a fine, drifting mist. The tower rose above us, darker than the sky, its great dial still fractured, still arrested at 20 minutes past 9. The city had not yet repaired it. Perhaps officials, like men, hesitated before restoring what had been made into a symbol. We stood beneath it in silence. The frozen hand seemed less like an accusation now than a caution, a reminder that ambition, when it loses patience with honest measures, may attempt to manufacture its own minutes. "Will they set it right?" I asked at last. Holmes's gaze remained upon the broken face. "They will replace the glass," he said. "They will file a new tooth, remove a wedge, and let the mechanism move again. The city will forget the particulars. It always does. And you?" I asked. Holmes's mouth tightened faintly. "I will not forget," he replied. "Because this was not merely a murder. It was a lesson in how easily men will accept a lie if it is printed large enough in the sky." Above us the silent tower held its halted hour, and in its fractured surface the lamplight trembled like a reflection disturbed by passing feet. London's restless life continuing beneath a timepiece that had, for one terrible minute, been made to serve human pride. Chapter XV. When time speaks, it is one of the paradoxes of London that the city can absorb even its most startling tragedies with an almost indifferent swiftness. A death that consumes the talk of taverns for a fortnight becomes, by the next month, a mere anecdote, and by the next season, a shadow, recalled only when some familiar corner is passed in the fog. The public imagination burns hot, but briefly, the public conscience, when soothed by the assurance that the matter has been dealt with, returns readily to its routines. Yet there are places that refuse, for a time, to let a story fade. They hold it in their stones, in their angles, in the way the light falls upon them. Weatherby Clock Tower was such a place. For weeks after Edmund Harrow's death, the tower stood with its great face cracked and arrested, the hands still fixed at 20 minutes past 9, as if the whole city had been compelled to pause. And remember, men crossed the square and glanced upward in spite of themselves. Clerks, late for appointments, cursed beneath their breath at the useless dial, and then looked again, as though expecting it to accuse them personally. Mothers hurried children past the base of the tower, as if the cold stones might somehow repeat what they had seen. Holmes, for his part, did not speak often of the case, once the law had taken its course. That is another of his peculiarities. He can pursue a mystery with a hunger that seems almost obsessive, but once the truth is established and the moral balance restored, he dismisses it from his daily thoughts as one might fold away a finished instrument. Yet I knew, even when he took up his violin again and allowed the familiar strains to drift through Baker Street, that the affair had lodged somewhere within him. Not because it had tested his intellect more harshly than others, but because it had revealed, in a public and demonstrative way, how easily men may be persuaded to accept a lie when it is large enough, loud enough, and timed to their expectations. It was therefore no surprise when one morning in early spring Holmes announced, with the quiet decisiveness that always preceded action, "The tower has been repaired." "How do you know?" I asked. Holmes tapped a folded newspaper beside his plate. A brief municipal notice stated that the Weatherby Clock Tower dial had been replaced and the mechanism restored, and that the tower would resume its chimes that very day. Holmes rose at once. "Come, Watson. There are moments in life when one must see a thing corrected, not for the sake of curiosity, but for the sake of closure." The day was pale but clear. The winter rain had at last withdrawn, leaving the streets washed and shining. A thin sunlight struggled through the clouds and turned the Thames to a dull ribbon of silver. We walked through the city with that peculiar sensation which comes after a notable event has passed. The streets unchanged, the people hurrying on, yet the mind still haunted by what had occurred in that place. When we reached Weatherby Square, I was struck at once by the difference. The tower stood as it always had, heavy and stern, but its face was transformed. Where once the shattered dial had glimmered like a broken eye, there now gleamed a new glass, smooth, unmarred, reflecting the daylight with clean indifference. The hands moved again, steady and certain, sweeping forward without hesitation. The whole effect was oddly disquieting, not because it was wrong, but because it was as though the tower itself had pretended nothing had ever happened. Holmes stopped at the center of the square, the same position from which he had studied the fracture lines, and lifted his eyes. For several minutes he stood silent, watching the minute hand advance. I watched with him, aware that it was approaching the very point which had become, for us more than a time, 20 minutes past 9. The hand reached it, and passed beyond it. Nothing arrested, nothing shattered, nothing cried out. The mechanism continued with the simple obedience of honest engineering. Holmes exhaled softly, as though some tension, long held, had at last been released. "You see, Watson," he said, "machinery obeys only the will imposed upon it." I glanced at him. "You mean that the clock was never at fault?" Holmes nodded. "A machine has no vanity, no envy, no resentment. It does not choose deception. It merely performs the conditions under which it is made to operate." His eyes remained upon the dial. "This tower," he continued, "was built to tell the truth. Yet for 1 minute it lied, because a human mind instructed it to lie. The failure was not in brass or glass. It was in character." We began to walk slowly around the square. People passed us without recognizing Holmes. The city rarely recognizes its saviors, unless they appear in uniform. A group of clerks paused briefly beneath the tower, consulted the dial, and moved on, trusting it as naturally as they trusted the pavement under their feet. Holmes watched them with faint irony. "It is always the same," he said quietly. "Men believe what is displayed with authority. A printed report, a uniformed statement, a clock face in the sky. They call it proof because it is public." "And yet," I said, "you read the cracks." Holmes's gaze sharpened slightly at the memory. "Yes," he replied. "The glass was a witness, silent but honest. Its fractures were not random. They spoke of force, of direction, of preparation. They pointed upward to the belfry where the line lay hidden. They contradicted the convenient story of accident." He paused near the base of the tower, where the ladder had once stood. "Edmund Harrow," he said, and for once his voice carried something like respect, unsoftened by irony, "was killed because he occupied a position that honest men often occupy without noticing. He stood at the point where a lie might be exposed by simple competence. He did not need to be heroic. He needed only to do his work well. That was enough to endanger those who wished time to be pliable." I recalled Harrow's meticulous bench, his tools arranged like surgical instruments, his half-finished watch left open as if he had only stepped away for a moment. The thought of him on the ladder, startled perhaps by the concussive shatter of glass, pressed upon me with a renewed heaviness. "And Reed?" I asked. "And Clark?" Holmes's mouth tightened faintly. "They will be judged," he said. "Clark by remorse, Reed by bitterness, both by law. Clark did not intend murder, but he performed it. Reed did not pull the rope, but he pulled the weaker fibers of a boy's need for approval. Between them they forced time and then pretended fate had done the work." He lifted his eyes again to the moving hands. "Envy," he added, "is always disguised, sometimes as righteousness, sometimes as grievance, sometimes, as in this case, as engineering." We stood a little apart as the tower's bell prepared to strike the next quarter. The new mechanism, free of wedge and altered tooth, gathered itself with calm inevitability. Then the chime rang out, clear, solemn, and utterly untroubled. It seemed to wash the square clean of its old silence. Holmes listened, head slightly tilted. When the last note faded, he spoke again, more softly. "There is a peculiar arrogance," he said, "in believing one can compel time without consequence. Men like Reed think only of the minute they need. 20 minutes past 9, fixed and unquestioned. They do not consider that time has a longer memory than any of us. And yet, I said, the city will forget. Holmes's eyes, still on the dial, held a quiet certainty. The city forgets details, he replied. But it remembers lessons, not in words perhaps, but in instinct. For a while, men will look twice at that clock. For a while, they will distrust the easy explanation. That is something. He turned at last. Behind us, the tower continued its steady work, indifferent to human pride. Its hands swept forward, minute by minute, refusing to be halted by old deceit. At the edge of the square, Holmes paused once more and looked back. The new glass caught the sunlight and reflected it cleanly. In that reflection, there was no crack, no accusation. Yet I could not help imagining the former dial, the jagged fractures that had seemed to spell their message to those who cared to read them. Time, I realized, had not failed. It had been forced, and in the very fact that it could be coerced, briefly, disastrously, lay the truth that Holmes had uncovered, that the greatest deceptions do not always require grand conspiracies, only a bitter man's suggestion and a weak boy's desire to be worthy. Holmes's voice, low and thoughtful, reached me as we walked. Remember this, Watson, he said. In every city there are clocks. In every life there are moments. The difference between honest time and manufactured time is not in the mechanism, but in the will that touches it. The tower chimed again behind us, solemn and precise. And though London surged onward, as it always did, I could not shake the sense that for once, even in its ordinary rhythm, the city had been made to hear what time had been trying, silently, to say